Godspeed, you black emperor. Charlatan. Emancipator. Megalomaniac. In this episode, we'll talk about a person whose controversial life is not easily defined. And to steal Churchill's famous quote, he was by all measure, quote, a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma. He wielded considerable influence during his fascinating life and was alternately loved and loathed for his radical and some would say contradictory beliefs and deeds. So let's delve deeper and learn more about this wily and wildly controversial and complicated character. And that is none other than the Jamaican-American revolutionary and would-be emperor, Marcus Garvey. Hello, friends, and welcome to Lost and Unfound, where we tell the true tales of the formerly famous, the infamous, and the forgotten. I'm Terry Allen, and thanks for joining us. He was born Marcus Mosiah Garvey in 1887 at St. Ann's Bay, a coastal town in north-central Jamaica. And by the way, for any music fans out there, this is the hometown of the great reggae singer Winston Rodney, better known as Burning Spear. And one of his greatest songs is the namesake of the star of this show. Marcus Garvey words come to pass. His family was middle class, maybe even upper middle class by the standards of the time and place. His father, Malchus, was a stonemason, and his mother was a domestic worker for a white planter family. His ancestors had been born into a long line of slavery. Old Dad Malchus was, by all accounts, a stern and severe taskmaster, self-taught and understandably troubled by the plight that his people faced in this colonial and racially fractured island. He made his living by inscribing birth and death dates on the headstones of his neighbors. There is a story that I think is worth telling, whereby, when fashioning a headstone in the local cemetery, he ordered the young Marcus to descend into a recently deceased man's grave and remain there for hours to ruminate on the life and the death of those that had come before. Marcus's formal education was sparse and erratic, and in his teen years he worked odd jobs as a menial laborer and eventually was apprenticed in printmaking. So his early years were rather unremarkable, but as we'll soon learn, the rest of his days were nothing of the sort. He moved to the capital of Kingston at around the age of 20 and joined a printing firm there, where he quickly rose through the ranks, eventually becoming the company's first Afro-Jamaican foreman at a young age. He was no doubt competent and diligent in his role, but he soon became disillusioned with the inequality that he would have observed all around him. It was during this period that he came to embrace trade unionism and led strikes that would eventually lead to his dismissal. And this is most likely the genesis of the radicalism that he would exhibit throughout the remainder of his life. He soon became involved in the nascent Jamaican nationalist movement and began rigorous studies both on his own and under the tutelage of Joseph Love, a Bahamian doctor who lived out his last years in Jamaica and was a strong advocate for the island's repressed black majority. Unable to find any further meaningful work in Kingston after his firing, he embarked on a nomadic trip throughout Central America, working itinerant jobs and establishing short-lived bilingual publications in various countries, all of which failed miserably. Next, it was off to the mother country of the British colonies, as it were, and he arrived in London in the spring of 1912. While there, he was a regular at the Visitors' Gallery at the Houses of Parliament, and also began his foray into public speaking, which he did at Speaker's Corner in Hyde Park. By the way, if you've never been there, you should go. After working some odd jobs in the big city, he was hired on by a magazine called the African Times and Orient Review, where he would eventually be invited to contribute articles written in his own hand. It seems he spent most of his downtime at the library of the British Museum, where he buried himself in the stacks and read ravenously in his continuing effort to advance the education that had heretofore eluded him. And it was there that he discovered and devoured the writings of the American educator and reformer Booker T. Washington, and in particular his seminal work, up from slavery. But broke and destitute, he had no real choice but to return home, which he did in 1914. But this is an important year in his trajectory as an important influencer, and that's because he founded an organization called, and it's a mouthful, the Universal Negro Association and African Communities League, eventually shortened to its acronym UNIA. Its credo was one aim, one God, one destiny. Now, what does that mean? It's pretty vague, but it will become clear, well, maybe, as our show progresses. He went on to say in describing the group's mission as to, quote, establish a brotherhood among the black race, to promote a spirit of race pride, to reclaim the fallen, and to assist in civilizing the backward tribes of Africa. He also actively encouraged Jamaicans to enlist in the British Army at the outset of the First World War, only to later recant this admonishment as the war proceeded. Now, those words seem antiquated to most of us today, and they were controversial then. So who is this guy? Is he a Pan-African black nationalist? Is he a defender of the old colonial order? Well, I warned you, his philosophy is complicated, so fasten that seatbelt and get ready for some car crashes along the way. Not surprisingly, he initially struggled to find many early followers to his mixed messages, but this was soon to change. It was during his rather desperate plight for adherents back home that he attracted a benefactor named Amy Ashwood. She was of a very complicated genealogy, which would have been common in Jamaica at this time, and she was an ardent believer in the Pan-African movement. She was of considerable means, and the two would eventually marry, only to have a major falling out down the line. A little more about that later. Though the UNIA gradually grew in Jamaica, Garvey seemed to understand that he was fishing in a small pond, and his bloated ego and his rabid opportunism drew him to a bigger stage, and so off he went to New York in 1916 to establish a chapter there. While residing in Harlem, he became associated with an even more fanatical man, and his name was Hubert Harrison. He was an ardent socialist, atheist, black nationalist, an exponent of many other isms, and he was known to some as the Black Socrates. The relationship between these two men was unique, as both at various times seemed to serve as both mentor and mentee to the other, as they were of roughly similar age. Though Garvey would go on to gain much greater notoriety and infamy, it was Harrison who was more of the bomb thrower. And there's no question that Harrison's influence led Garvey from radicalism to flat-out militancy. Garvey's group quite rapidly gained a growing membership in New York, and in 1918, the UNIA officially established an auxiliary arm called the African Communities League, the aim of which was to establish various commercial enterprises which would promote his teachings. Well, despite garnering probably around 1,000 dues-paying members at this point, his aggressive aims also attracted the suspicions and ire of some of the UNIA's disaffected members, and also those outside of their ranks. Some of these folks began to vocally question his true loyalties, and openly accused him of being a quack and a charlatan, claims that would shadow him throughout his entire life. The real question here is whether he was true to his stated cause, or whether he was just an egotist and opportunist out for financial gain and personal adoration. He also, unsurprisingly, caught the attention of the Bureau of Investigation, the precursor of what we know today as the FBI, which had begun to monitor his speeches and rallies. Despite these suspicions, the UNIA periodical Negro World had grown to 10,000 subscribers, primarily in the U.S., but also in Canada and the Caribbean and even West Africa. Now, I'm not sure how a newspaper was able to make it to West Africa at that time. Garvey claimed 2 million members by the following year, which is not only an exaggeration, but totally laughable. But what is not in question is that his audience and influence was surely growing. Well, to buttress this growth, here comes Amy Ashwood again, and she sailed from Panama to join Marcus in New York, and was soon after appointed, quote, General Secretary of the organization. But it's here at this pivotal point that the UNIA would run up against the better funded and organized NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement for Colored People, a group still very much in existence today and of which many in the audience will be familiar. The primary schism here is between the fight for racial integration, as espoused by the NAACP's W.E. Du Bois, and the fight for black separatism and nationalism, as now promulgated by Garvey. These two leaders pretended to play nice for a while, but they soon came to despise one another, with the erudite and debonair Du Bois referring to Garvey as, quote, a little fat black man, ugly, but with intelligent eyes and a big head, and the latter describing the former as, quote, a reactionary under the pay of white men. But despite this acrimony, the cult of Garvey continued to grow, and the UNIA established several businesses. The group organized grand parades in and around Harlem, attended by crowds numbering in the tens of thousands, and these were real spectacles. And it was during these raucous events that he would shout bombastic proclamations through a megaphone from the rear seat of a chauffeur-driven Cadillac convertible. But chaos was in the ranks, as it always was, with many disparate factions within that entity squabbling on all matters of policy. Things came to a head in 1919 when a disgruntled member and former employee named George Tyler came a-calling. Tyler was there to assassinate Garvey, and he almost did so, shooting him in both legs and the face. But Garvey miraculously survived this attack, no doubt lending to his legend amongst his supporters, and was soon back to his soapbox and megaphone within weeks. Tyler, the would-be assassin, no doubt fearing for his own life, took matters into his own hands and leapt to his death by suicide from the Harlem jail. Bloodied but unbowed, our fearless leader proposed marriage to Amy Ashwood, and they were married on Christmas Day of that year with a reported 3,000 UNIA members in attendance. In 1920, Garvey, with the supposed encouragement of his fawning followers, essentially anointed himself the Provisional President of Africa. This was a very Napoleonic move, and he bestowed gaudy accolades to his toadies, such as the Order of the Nile and the Order of Ethiopia. Never mind that he had never visited Africa, nor would he ever, nor did he possess any formal recognition or power of any kind on that continent. Well, here he goes again, and as if his professional life were not chaotic enough, his personal life was even messier. After just 3 months of marriage, he sought an annulment from Ashwood on the grounds of his accusations of infidelity, fraud, and alcoholism. She would go on to accuse him of the same. The two fought each other in divorce court over the next few years, only to have their brief union end in an essential stalemate, which would cause him further legal troubles down the road. Though these two were no more, Ashwood would remain active as an artist and activist during the heart of the Harlem Renaissance, and she would make occasional cameo appearances throughout the remainder of his life. During this period, he launched yet another ambitious endeavor, a maritime shipping company that he called the Black Star Line. This was a play on words of the White Star Line, which was a British shipping operation that focused on transporting citizens of the British Isles to North America and back and forth. It is most notable as the owner and operator of the Titanic, which famously sank years earlier and claimed as many as 1,500 lives. So, was he joking? Was this mockery? Was this just chest pounding? His vision for this business was to establish a completely black-financed, black-owned, black-staffed nautical enterprise that catered to an exclusively black clientele, which would transport people and goods to and from the U.S., Africa, and the Caribbean. This ambitious project would not only fail financially, it would come to land Garvey into legal hot water, financial ruin, and eventually imprisonment. In an effort to raise the needed funds, he parlayed his growing notoriety in the Northeast and the Midwest with some of his associates and was initially quite successful in raising a healthy portion of the $2 million in stock sales that he sought. But the inevitable infighting spilled over once again, and he was arrested in Chicago for selling securities without the required license. But he inveigles himself out of the latest setbacks, and he managed to purchase, actually lease, a rotting steamship. Some labeled it a ghost ship, called the Yarmouth, which had been built in Nova Scotia 50 years prior. Garvey attempted to change its name officially to the Frederick Douglass, but the proper papers were never filed, and so it remained registered as the Yarmouth. And so with great fanfare and thousands applauding, this doomed ship launched its inaugural voyage under the UNIA banner en route to Cuba and Jamaica. Though declared seaworthy by its new shipmaster, another Bahamian-born sea captain named Joshua Coburn, other mariners questioned this opinion. And furthermore, he struggled to recruit enough able-bodied black seamen, so he was forced to hire sailors of various races. So the enterprise is off to a very precarious start. It would go on to make a few trips to Jamaica, Cuba, Panama, and Costa Rica, but each journey was plagued by mechanical failures and financial hardship, and was eventually scrapped for pennies on the dollar within a few years of its relaunch. Prior to its failure as a viable business endeavor, Garvey himself had made a voyage on the ship back to his native Jamaica, where he lambasted his countrymen for their lack of enthusiasm for his venture. And he railed, quote, "Negroes are the most lazy, the most careless, and indifferent people in the world." He then went on to Panama, where he again affronts people in the mostly Afro-Panamanian region of Almirante, and he calls them, quote, "a bunch of ignorant and impertinent Negroes. No wonder you are where you are, and for my part, you can stay where you are." Wow, this is a strange marketing strategy for a guy that's the self-proclaimed emperor of Africa and savior of the black race. Unsurprisingly, he tried and failed several times to return to the United States after the latest debacle. But he was eventually granted a visa, and he returned to New York in 1922. But he was soon arrested again, this time for fraud regarding his questionable business dealings. He found himself hounded by both the U.S. government, the BOI in particular, and many of his former supporters and investors who had thrown up their hands and decided he was a total fraud. He chose to direct his ire mostly to the latter, and particularly his nemesis, the NAACP, whom he accused of treachery and disloyalty to race and justice. This essentially marked the end of the Black Star Line once and for all, and also the end of his credibility as the would-be emperor. But this self-proclaimed savior of his own wider race confounds us again when he embarks on a speaking tour in the western United States, where he met with various members of the Ku Klux Klan, which was nearing its apogee at this time, and he proclaims the following, quote, "I regard the Klan as better friends of the race, as all other hypocritical whites put together. I like honesty and fair play. Call me a Klansman if you will, but potentially every white man is a Klansman as the Negro is concerned, and there is no use lying. We've run into these seemingly counterintuitive declarations before, as covered in our companion show, Well Hung History, where years later the American Nazi leader George Lincoln Rockwell held court with the American black Muslim leader Elijah Muhammad. We even see it again later, where Louis Farrakhan and David Duke have been known to share the same stage together. He finds himself in trouble again, as he always is, but these dalliances with race baiters on the other side of the race divide were a tad too much for many of his previous supporters, and he was asked to resign from the organization that he had founded. Many other former friends and allies argued that he should even be deported back to Jamaica. But despite dissension within the ranks, Garvey and the UNIA soldiered on, and at the organization's 1922 annual conference, he managed a purge of sorts, which saw many of its highest-ranking officials that had grown leery of him either resign or be permanently expelled. Among those sacked was the Reverend James Eason, who had moved from a loyal supporter to an outspoken critic. For this, he was assassinated by UNIA members in New Orleans in January of the following year, and though Garvey denied any direct complicity in the assassination, he nevertheless did raise funds for those accused of committing the crime. Following this episode, a group of prominent black leaders published an open letter accusing Garvey of being, quote, an unscrupulous demagogue who has ceaselessly and assiduously sought to spread among Negroes distrust and hatred of all white people. He predictably waded into the muddle, calling his detractors octoroons and quadroons, those being of mixed race, and accusing them of, quote, the greatest bit of treachery and wickedness that any group of Negroes could be capable of. In May of 1923, he and 3 others were finally hauled into court under charges of defrauding disgruntled investors of the Black Star Line debacle. His attorney, Cornelius McDougald, urged him to plead guilty and receive a lighter sentence, but he was having none of that, and he chose instead to represent himself. Well, I think we've all seen enough crime shows to know that this tact virtually never works, and the case of Garvey was no different. His closing statement lasted 3 hours, and in it he blamed everyone and everything but himself. And after several more hours of deliberation, he was found guilty, though his 3 associates were cleared of all charges. When the verdict was read aloud, he went on a verbal rampage, calling the judge and the DA, quote, damn dirty Jews. Though the rants were expected, the anti-Semitic outburst was not, as he had been a vocal supporter of Zionism in the past. He was given 5 years and fined $1,000 and sent away to a cell in the dreaded Tombs in Manhattan. His stint in jail would prove to be a short one, though, at least for the time being, as UNIA members were able to raise the $15,000 bail bond to secure his release, which they did in September of 1923. During his brief taste of freedom, he continued to promote his belief in racial segregation and voluntary repatriation of black Americans to Africa. He even sent UNIA emissaries to Liberia to negotiate terms of relocation, but they were promptly arrested upon their arrival there and swiftly returned to the U.S. But a year or so later, his bail was revoked by the U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals, and he was returned to prison, this time to the federal pen in Atlanta, which was the temporary home to several other characters featured on this show. While incarcerated, he wrote and received copious letters to and from his remaining supporters, and he also received frequent guests, including friends and noted white supremacists John Powell and Ernest Severe Cox. Always overweight and generally unhealthy throughout his life, his health began to wane further in prison. He began to suffer from chronic bronchitis, lung problems, and he had to be hospitalized with a severe case of influenza. After receiving 70,000 signatures advocating for his release and feeling political pressure to do so, President Calvin Coolidge authorized his immediate release from custody in 1925 after serving roughly half of his 5-year term. However, there was one very important caveat. He was to be deported back to his native Jamaica. Garvey was taken by train under armed guard to New Orleans, where around 1,000 supporters had assembled to see him off. After a brief stop in Panama, where he was refused permission to disembark for fear of public disruption, he arrived in Kingston to a gaggle of supporters. Thanks to $10,000 now in funds raised by his supporters, he bought a large house in a swanky part of town that he named Somali Court. Now back home in the land of his birth, he settled into his new dwelling and took receipt of his personal belongings left behind in New York. These included hundreds of antiques, African art, and 18,000 books. He was elected a city councilor after establishing the island's first organized political party, which he called the PPP, the People's Political Party. Simple enough. His platform advocated land rights for tenant farmers, a minimum wage, and fierce opposition to Asian and Arab immigration, which had been on the rise to supplement a lack of qualified native labor. He was also again arrested and briefly jailed, this time for impugning the judiciary, which he considered corrupt. But soon he found himself broke once again under the financial strains of the Great Depression, and not for the first time. He grew despondent about his own plight on the island and that of the UNIA in general. He confided to a friend that, quote, "I leave Jamaica a broken man, broken in spirit, broken in health, and broken in pocket. I will never, never, never go back." So his gypsy wanderings take him once again to his old stomping grounds of London, where he arrived in 1935. He established a UNIA office in Kensington, and he published a new periodical called Black Man. He also resumed his taking to the soapbox at Speaker's Corner in Hyde Park, though the crowds that once eagerly turned up to hear him rant and rave were noticeably much smaller. His peculiar and revolutionary demagoguery had largely fallen out of favor, and his social views were branded as reactionary by a new generation of radicals. In particular, he caused a stir by originally supporting and then berating the Ethiopian leader Haile Selassie, whose would-be war of liberation against colonial Italy was failing. When Selassie fled his country for exile in England, Garvey attempted to meet him at the train station, but his entreaty was denied. This enraged him further, and he called the Ethiopian, quote, "a great coward who ran away from his country to save his own skin." Ironically, many of those friendly to the African leader accused Garvey in kind of the exact same thing. In 1937, he embarked on a final barnstorming tour of Canada and the Caribbean, but the great throngs that he once attracted had dwindled to mere gatherings of the old diehards, and the UNIA's coffers soon ran thin. In January 1940, now in his early 50s and back in London, he suffered a debilitating stroke, which left him severely paralyzed and unable to feed, bathe, or dress himself. He lingered on for a few more months until a final massive stroke finished him off on June 10th. He was initially interred in the catacombs at St. Mary's Catholic Cemetery in Kensal Green, London. Wakes and processions of considerable size were held in New York and Kingston and other places where he had maintained a loyal following. It's even said that many of his acolytes, even after being shown photographs of him in his coffin, refused to believe that he had died and insisted it was a government conspiracy to keep him from doing God's work. But even from the grave, Marcus Garvey would not really be silenced, and a veritable cult began to grow posthumously around his life and teachings beginning in the 1950s, and lasting in various iterations to this day. Back home in Jamaica, the land he had shunned, his reputation underwent a sort of Lazarus resurrection, and after great fanfare his remains were reinterred and reburied at King George VI Memorial Park in Kingston, where they rest today.
This concludes the latest episode of Lost and Unfound. Keep watching on YouTube or find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and all the socials. New episodes drop regularly. And if you like what you see, please subscribe. It really does help us create new and fresh content. And be sure to check out our companion site, Well Hung History, where we tell true tales of the condemned and the executed. Copyright Tom Payne Productions, all rights reserved and preserved.